Sunday marks 20 years since the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom, the US-led invasion that toppled Saddam Hussein. The military operation was launched without UN support, unlike the first Gulf War or the invasion of Afghanistan. Our diplomatic editor, James Bays, looks at how the invasion damaged the credibility of the United Nations.
UN weapons inspectors in Iraq, their job to track down the country's chemical and biological weapons. We now know there weren't any. The former Iraqi ruler Saddam Hussein had ceased his WMD program years earlier. But in 2003, US President George Bush, backed by the British Prime Minister Tony Blair, was saying he was hiding a huge stockpile, and they claimed they had the intelligence to prove it. The US Secretary of State Colin Powell, now known to have been privately sceptical himself, tried to make the case in the Security Council, even wielding a vial he said could be anthrax. The US and UK, bitterly opposed by much of the international community, including France and Germany, failed to get a Security Council resolution to authorise a war. They launched one anyway. In the aftermath, one British diplomat who'd worked as his country's expert on Iraq in the Security Council resigned. Do you think the United Nations ended up damaged or strengthened by the war 20 years ago?
I think without doubt it was damaged by it. The Secretary General of the United Nations didn't assert his authority to say that the war was illegal and should not happen, which later he admitted. And I think collectively, the quote-unquote UN, this sense of a global community of nations, a sense of a shared set of rules, took a very big hit as a result of the Iraq War.
So where does that leave things now, 20 years on? Once again, the Security Council is deeply divided, and there's no doubt that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, a permanent member, was a breach of international law and of the UN Charter. But Western diplomats, when you speak to them privately, will tell you that their efforts to put pressure on Moscow are even now hindered by the memory of what happened 2 decades ago. The run-up to the war in Iraq in 2003 was marked by defiance and disinformation, resulting in deep damage to the UN system and the rule of law around the world. So much may have changed since, but the repercussions of events that haunted the UN then are still being felt. James Bays, Al Jazeera, at the United Nations.
So let's bring in Faisal al-Istrabadi. He's a former Iraqi diplomat and founding director of the Center for the Study of the Middle East at Indiana University. Joins us live from Bloomington. Faisal, good to have you with us. So look, the legacy of the Iraq War, I think, is very much still being decided, still being written. But do you think the invasion by the US-led coalition was a success or a disappointing failure?
Well, it was a little bit of both. It has been disappointing to those of us who went back to Iraq after spending years in exile to try to rebuild the country, to realize that the forces armed against us were a little rather stronger than we had anticipated. And I myself made the decision that there was no particular point in my continuing. So I resigned as ambassador and left. But on the other hand, a brutal tyrant, one who had terrorized his own people, killing hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians, and who had invaded 2 neighboring states, was removed. And that will be remembered, I think, by history as an absolute good.
OK, so what about Iraq today? I mean, many Iraqis still see the political system as deeply corrupt. The sectarian divide between Sunni and Shia remains problematic. Militias still roam around. So has real political and economic progress been made for ordinary Iraqis on the streets?
Not what should have been made, no. The economic problems of the country have not begun to be addressed by any of the successive governments, and that's deeply problematic. Unfortunately, we have a governing system which favors the sectarian divisions that the political class has benefited from. If you speak to ordinary Iraqis in the street, you will find they're not nearly as divided as their political class, but the system drives It's sort of this, the governing system in Iraq is almost a living organism which has its own drive to survive. And that is deeply problematic. But what the Iraqis have today that they did not have 20 years ago is hope that the future will be better than it was. If the Americans and their allies had not removed Saddam, either he or one of his two sons would be ruling Iraq today.
Faisal, you're a former Iraqi diplomat and you've represented Iraq at the UN. Many experts say, look, the UN at the time failed to exercise its authority and stand up to the US and the UK in saying the war was illegal. How much damage did this do to the credibility of the United Nations, do you think?
Well, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, on the 8th of 2002, the Security Council passed Resolution 1441 under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, holding that Iraq was in material breach of its disarmament obligation. So let's keep that straight. There are ample legal arguments for why the war was legal. I'm a lawyer myself. I can make those arguments. I won't trouble you with them. Let me answer your question. Yes, I represented Iraq in 2004 and for a number of years thereafter at the United Nations. The fact of the matter is that the United Nations Security Council, which is the body we really mean, the Secretary General has no power to stop a member state from doing anything. It's the Security Council. By design, the Security Council can only act when there is unanimity amongst the 5 permanent members. As your setup piece pointed out, there were only 2 members who were advocating for a Security Council resolution reauthorizing the use of force. The other 3 were against. So that's how the UN is designed.
Just a final thought to you, Faisal. How do you think history then will remember Operation Iraqi Freedom? I mean, this was a war, as you pointed out, didn't have UN support. They didn't find weapons of mass destruction, yet the US-led coalition still went to war anyway on now discredited intelligence. So how will this invasion and its aftermath be remembered, do you think?
Well, that's going to be in the eye of the beholder. The same is true of Kosovo. There was no UN Security Council authorization for Kosovo. There's absolutely no question that the Kosovo war was illegal. A UN commission appointed by Kofi Annan said so, although it called it illegal but legitimate, which is an incoherent phrase. And so it's how you viewed the war at the time, 20 years later, is still how you're going to view it. If things work out in Iraq, history won't be bothered by the legal subtleties of 2003. And Iraq has a 7,000-year history. I'm not going to rule it out after only 20 years.
Faisal al-Istrabadi, really to get your thoughts and your analysis, Faisal. Thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you.